From the very first day Jake bought his land, the small creek running through it felt like a gift from nature itself. Its gentle stream sparkled under the sunlight, attracting birds and keeping the ground fertile. For generations, that creek had been the heartbeat of the property, a natural lifeline that kept everything around it alive. But one summer morning, Jake woke up to the thunder of heavy machinery. Dust filled the air, men in neon vests shouted orders, and concrete trucks lined the street. The creek, his creek, was being poured over with slabs of gray cement. Jake's heart sank as he ran toward the noise. Standing in front of the machines was none other than Karen, the HOA president. With arms crossed and a smug smile, she declared, "That little ditch was an eyesore. We're improving the neighborhood's look." Jake's protest was drowned out by the rumble of engines. Neighbors watched from a distance, some whispering, some nodding nervously at Karen's authority. The once lively stream was silenced in just a few hours, buried beneath a lifeless stretch of hardened concrete. Jake stood there, fists trembling, realizing this wasn't just about the creek. This was about respect, about ownership, about his home. And as he stared at the fading shimmer of water seeping into the ground, he made a silent promise. Karen had made a mistake she would regret. In the weeks that followed, Jake noticed something odd. The grass in his yard began to dry out, yellow patches spreading where once it had been green. Birds no longer perched on his fences, and the soil hardened like clay. Nature itself seemed to recoil from the absence of the creek. But Jake wasn't the only one affected. Down the road, Karen's carefully manicured lawns turned brittle. Neighbors began complaining about stagnant puddles forming in their backyards. "It's just the summer heat," Karen insisted at the HOA meeting, her voice sharp as she dismissed their concerns. Jake said nothing, but deep down he knew the truth. The creek had always been more than just water. It had absorbed runoff, balanced the ground, and kept the natural drainage alive. Without it, the earth was suffocating. Late one evening, Jake walked along the hardened strip of concrete, tracing the path where water once flowed. He placed his palm against the cool surface and whispered, "You're not gone. Not yet." And with that, he began gathering old records, property deeds, environmental maps, and photographs of the creek in its prime. Karen had buried the water, but Jake was about to unearth the truth. 2 months later, the first storm hit. At first, it was nothing unusual, just summer rain. But with the creek sealed, the water had nowhere to go. Yards flooded within hours, driveways turned into shallow ponds, and basements filled with dampness. Jake stood by his window as rain hammered the roof. He watched as Karen's prized rose garden disappeared under brown water. By morning, the neighborhood looked less like a luxury community and more like a swamp. The once pristine streets were lined with soggy furniture, trash bins floating, and neighbors pacing in disbelief. Karen, of course, tried to spin the disaster. "This is just temporary," she shouted at angry homeowners. But Jake knew better. The land was reclaiming what had been stolen. The creek was gone, but its purpose remained, and the ground demanded balance. Jake quietly began taking photos and videos, documenting everything. He knew that proof would matter more than anger. As he clicked one last picture of Karen standing ankle-deep in swamp water, he couldn't help but think, this was only the beginning. Determined to fight smart, Jake dug through his grandfather's old boxes stored in the attic. Inside, he found yellow documents from the county water department, dating back nearly 50 years. The creek wasn't just a pretty feature. It was a legally protected natural waterway. Jake's hands shook as he read the papers. Karen hadn't just made a poor decision. She had violated environmental law. Armed with this knowledge, Jake visited the county office the next morning. The clerk's eyebrows rose as he laid out the documents. Within hours, inspectors were dispatched to the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around the flooded street, telling neighbors she had everything under control. That confidence cracked the moment county officials pulled up in white trucks, clipboards in hand. They examined the cement-filled creek bed, took water samples, and spoke in hushed tones Jake could only partially overhear. By the time they left, Karen's smirk had faded. Something had shifted. Jake didn't smile, But inside, he felt a spark of hope. Justice was stirring. A week later, the official reports landed. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the words burning into his mind. Illegal alteration of a natural waterway. Fines, penalties, and mandatory restoration orders filled the pages. But the most shocking part was the estimate. The HOA would be responsible for nearly $500,000 in damages. When the notice reached Karen, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Some homeowners, furious about their ruined basements, demanded answers. Others quietly approached Jake, thanking him for speaking up. Karen tried to spin the narrative, insisting the creek had been a useless ditch and that Jake was overreacting. But the rising stench of stagnant water in the air betrayed her lies. The swamp was undeniable, and so was the truth. Jake remained calm, letting the evidence speak. He didn't need to yell or argue. He simply let Karen's empire crumble under the weight of her own arrogance. As restoration crews arrived, tearing up the concrete and digging trenches to let the water flow again, Karen's control unraveled. Homeowners refused to pay their skyrocketing HOA fees. Emergency meetings turned chaotic, voices rising as residents demanded Karen step down. Jake watched it all unfold quietly from his porch. The creek's path was slowly being restored, the trickle of water returning like a long-forgotten friend. Birds began to circle overhead again, as if nature itself was reclaiming its territory. Karen, once untouchable, now stood isolated. The same neighbors who once feared her power now turned their backs. With lawsuits piling and fines drowning her, the weight of her decisions finally crushed her reign. For Jake, it wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. And as he listened to the first sound of water trickling once more, he felt something deeper: peace. Months later, the neighborhood looked entirely different. Where there had been stagnant swamp water, the creek now flowed fresh and clear, winding gracefully through the land. Children played along its banks, skipping stones just as Jake once had. The homes that once stood in soggy misery now breathed again, their lawns lush and green. The air felt lighter, freer. Karen, however, was gone. Her empire shattered, her reputation in ruins. The HOA was restructured, this time with leaders who valued the land and its people, not just appearances. Jake walked the length of the creek one quiet morning, the sunlight dancing across its rippling surface. He knelt down, letting the cool water run through his fingers, and whispered, "Welcome back." The battle had been long, but the victory wasn't just his. It was nature's, and the community's too. In the end, Jake hadn't just saved a creek. He had reminded everyone that no matter how much concrete is poured, truth always finds its way to the surface.